and welcome to the CLC Tax Talk Podcast Episode 1 about corporate income tax and permanent establishment in Azerbaijan. I'm Maya, a tax lawyer here at CLC, and I'll be your host today. We are excited to launch this series where we will break down key tax and legal issues in Azerbaijan and making them easier to understand for businesses and professionals alike. For this episode, I am joined by my colleague Frangis, who is a tax manager here at Caspian Legal Center. Welcome, Frangis.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. I am really glad to be here and even more excited about our first episode. It is a great opportunity to share some insights, which we will talk about today, corporate income tax and permanent establishment rules, which is come up very often in practice.
Absolutely. Let's start with the basics, just to set the scene. We will focus on what foreign businesses and non-resident entities must know about CIT and possible tax exposures. Could you briefly explain what corporate income tax is in Azerbaijan and what the general rate looks like?
Yeah, sure. Corporate income tax is basically the tax on net profits. In Azerbaijan, the general corporate income tax rate is 20%. This is for resident legal entities and this applies to their worldwide income. But for non-residents, tax applies only to income sourced from Azerbaijan.
So, when these tax obligations should be paid and what is the period to file the declarations?
Well, the annual corporate income tax of the current year should be filed and paid until the end of the March of the following year. However, until the final declaration, there should be like 4 quarterly advance payments. But for the withholding tax purposes, the declaration is quarterly and tax payments should be made 20th of the following months after the quarter, which is also quarterly.
How the submission of the reports should be? I mean, is it paper-based or electronic?
No, the whole process in Azerbaijan is electronic. However, if there is a case that it is not possible to send the declaration electronic or there is a problem, then paper-based submission is also possible.
That's straightforward. So, back to non-residents. The key question becomes what exactly counts as Azerbaijani sourced income?
Yes, exactly. Like for non-residents are taxed in Azerbaijan when they generate income from an Azerbaijani source. Like this can include things providing services, earning royalties, renting property, or even selling goods if the sales occurs in Azerbaijan. Essentially, if the economic benefit is connected to Azerbaijan, then tax obligations may arise. But now, how that income is taxed really depends on whether or not the non-resident has a permanent establishment in Azerbaijan. That is the central distinction in our tax systems, so we need to focus on that.
That makes sense. So, permanent establishment, or PE, is really the deciding factor, isn't it? Could you explain how this concept works in Azerbaijan?
Of course. If a non-resident has a permanent establishment in Azerbaijan, like meaning a fixed place of business, like here we can say maybe it can be a branch, office, or even a construction site that continues beyond the threshold period, which is generally than 3 months under our tax code. But maybe there can be some different provisions in the double taxation treaties. Then they are taxed in the same way as resident companies, like which means 20% corporate income tax on their profits. But if there is no permanent establishment, then like Azerbaijani sourced income is taxed at the level of withholding tax, depending on the type of income.
Okay, and withholding tax is something clients ask about all the time. People want to know if I'm doing business with Azerbaijan, how much of my income might get withheld at source? Could you please share a few common examples from the tax code?
Yeah, exactly. Like this question we always get from our clients too. I can say that, for example, dividends paid to non-residents are subject to 5% withholding tax. For interest payments, the tax is 10%. Royalties are taxed at 14% and 10% for the services. There are other categories and rates as well, but these are very frequently we use in practice. And it is important to remember that these rates can be reduced if there is a double taxation treaty. And for most of the cases, there is.
That is a perfect transition to my next question, actually. Double taxation treaties or DTAs. They often refine or reduce the general rules, right? Can you give us an example?
Yes, exactly. There is like for the most of the treaties, the provisions are same, but it can be different sometimes. We can give an example from the royalties. Under the tax code, royalties are taxed at 14% at source, but under the treaties, for example, the treaty between Azerbaijani and United Kingdom, most royalties are capped at 10%. So if a Baku company pays a UK company for the right to use of software or know-how, and the treaty applies, the withholding tax can drop from 14% to the 10%.
Now walk us through permanent establishment under the tax code. What actually creates a PE?
I would say time and location. Because a non-resident, if has a permanent establishment in Azerbaijan, and if it carries on commercial activity here for the last 90 days in any 12 months period, either directly or through another right person. The classic example can be like place of management, an office or branch and division, even like construction site, oil and gas explorations also. The places where goods are produced or services are actually performed in Azerbaijan. Like, so a mere branch registration without commercial activity in Azerbaijan meeting time threshold doesn't amount to PA. It is possible that there are 90 plus days already passed from the branch registration, but it still doesn't consider the PA because of the commercial activity lasts less than 90 days.
So which cases need more attention, and did you face any specific cases in practice, for example?
In simple terms, storage and display of your own goods doesn't create a permanent establishment, and neither does buying goods or collecting information for your own needs. These are called like preparatory or auxiliary activities, and they are not running a business in Azerbaijan. If you and your related companies, let's say, do these activities together in Azerbaijan, and together they stop being provide these preparatory and auxiliary activities. So the tax authority can treat the whole setup as a permanent establishment. But here, one interesting case we handled recently, I can say from like Formula One race in Baku, our client was involved in short-term sponsorship and service arrangements in Formula One race. The twist was that they had to obtain a tax identification number in Azerbaijan, which according to the tax authority, the client is qualified tax residency or permanent establishment after they get their tax identification number. But here is the thing that we argued existence of the registering as a taxpayer alone doesn't trigger permanent establishment status. Like under both domestic legislation and tax treaties, what matters is not the administrative issuance of the registration, but the actual presence and nature of business operations on the ground. Then we demonstrated that having this registration didn't automatically equate to having operational activity in Azerbaijan. And without that, there is no basis for corporate income tax obligations because this is not a local entity. It was a good example that how important it is to distinguish between formal registration and substantive presence when dealing with permanent establishment and withholding tax risks.
Okay. Is there any different approach in DTTs?
DTTs, human double taxation treaties?
Yes.
Yeah, often yes. A common change is the construction threshold. Under many treaties, including like Azerbaijan and UK, also other countries, a construction installation site becomes permanent establishment only after 12 months. And for providing services, including consultancy, considering employees will be engaged in process the company, let's say, then the period will have like 6 months. The company will have permanent establishment in Azerbaijan after 6 months.
Now, moving on. One compliance question we often hear from clients is who actually has the obligation to pay withholding tax on behalf of the non resident?
Um, The responsibility lies with the Azerbaijan resident payer. In other words, the local company or individual making the payment to the non-resident must withhold the tax and transfer it to the state budget, which is taxation. And importantly, if the non-resident has a permanent establishment here, that permanent establishment also treated just like a resident entity and also carries the obligation to withhold tax when making the payments.
And that's important because non-residents can't really pay Azerbaijani tax directly themselves. They rely on the payer here to act as a tax agent. That sometimes can actually be a little frustrating for foreign companies because they have no direct control over the process and they need to trust that the Azerbaijani partner withholds and reports correctly, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is the challenging situation we always face. And in practice, I can say that besides the contractual payer, other resident taxpayers in Azerbaijan can also act as a tax agent for the non-residents, depending on the transaction structure. So this gives some flexibility, but it also makes it crucial for non-residents to clarify in contracts that how withholding will be handled.
That actually makes sense. Now, one thing that helps a lot in these situations is double taxation treaties. They can reduce or sometimes even exempt certain payments from withholding tax, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Like if a double taxation agreement applies, the withholding tax rate can be reduced below the domestic rate. Or in some cases, the income can be exempt altogether. Like, for instance, in some treaties, technical service fees may be exempt if there is no permanent establishment.
So, if a company wants to benefit from a treaty, how do they actually apply for it?
Here, there are two main application forms we can use. This is DTA 3 and DTA 5 forms. DTA 3 is issued to apply to get reduction or exemption of withholding tax before the payment. DTA 03 is obtained to use withholding tax exemption or lower tax rate in the treaty with respect to income derived by non-residents in Azerbaijan. But if entities could not send this reduction or exemption application in time, then it is possible to submit for DTA 5 form, which should be like after the payment. In this case, withholding tax would be deducted and then an application for refund be requested. In other words, this form enables the non-resident entity to obtain a refund for the overpaid tax amounts. That should be paid in the non-resident country, but paid in Azerbaijan actually.
And what about the deadlines? Are there any deadlines of these applications?
Yes, for DTA 3 form, it should be applied to the tax authorities until the end of the quarter of the payment was made. But for the refund application, non-resident may apply with an application form no later than 5 years after the end of the tax reporting period.
That's very clear. So, companies need to be proactive if they want to benefit from treaty relief, right?
Yeah, exactly. Planning ahead is essential, I would say, because from our practice, we always see that it is easier to get reduction or exemption beforehand. However, for the refund process, tax services position is more decisive to provide refund from the state budget.
Now, before we close, what would be your recommendations from your practice?
I would say the essential thing can be like obtain professional support in advance of operations. If you want to do works or provide services in Azerbaijan, just be sure that you will have professional support here because you will need someone who knows the practice, details, and how to handle transactions. I would also emphasize the importance of understanding the domestic tax rules here because it is not enough to just rely on the general international practice, or companies need to know how the Azerbaijani tax code treats this permanent establishment, withholding, and documentation process. And one more thing, that keep in mind that in some cases, especially for refund applications, it may even take several months to get actual refund in practice, and it can affect the overall tax planning.
Well, that brings us to the end of our podcast. A big thank you to my colleague Frangiz for joining me and sharing her insights today.
Thank you, Maya. I hope we can explain everything clearly and it will be understandable. And I also want to thanks to everyone who tuned in.
And thank you to our listeners for being with us for this episode of the CLC Tax Talk Podcast. We will be back soon with more discussions on tax and legal issues that matter to businesses in Azerbaijan and beyond. Until next time.